And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Andrew Nairne, who's going to introduce our panel tonight.
Well, I think Inga's going to introduce the panel in a moment. But Tania, first of all, the thank yous are totally mutual. Thank you to the Osborne Samuel Gallery, the whole team here, Matthew, Peter. It's wonderful. And wow, can we just pause and notice we're surrounded by seriously great art? I certainly feel, on one level, I feel really at home. On the other side, apart from our ones, of course, there are other works by many of the Kettle artists. I want my private tour. I can give a little bit of a tour on one or two, but definitely not all. Isn't this absolutely fabulous? I spoke to somebody earlier, we were also standing around, and this often happens to me, sort of two possibilities. And I said, oh, do you know Kettle? Of course I know Kettle, so I shouldn't really have asked. And then there's the other kind that says, I've been trying for years. So there's some of you who have been trying for years, but can I remind you that it's 50 minutes on the train from King's Cross, and then it's a 15-minute, 20-minute taxi ride. Please come. You will be our guest. We will look after you. You will love the house, and we also do, I think, very inspirational, original exhibitions as well, sometimes related to the house. And actually often crossovers where contemporary artists does bits and pieces in the house. Jim Ede famously said the house, Kettle Yard, should change very slowly. And Inga and I were always sort of constantly thinking, how do we interpret this very slowly? You know, can it sort of accelerate slightly very slowly, and then sort of go back to do very slowly? But we've just closed the Rebecca who made the Magda Słowaska show, which was wonderful, and she made some beautiful, what we call kind of interventions in the house, and one of them's still there, so that's very special. The other thing that's special in the house at the moment has just gone up, and in fact I should get Inga to speak about it. It's a William Scott painting on a wall that we've kind of liberated in the extension, and it's a, what's it called?
Ocean.
Ocean. It's the most beautiful title because it's blue, with sort of white strands. It's quite large. When was it made?
1960.
1960. Anyway, these are other reasons to come because we had this painting on loan from the Bonus family for a year. It used to hang above Alan Bonus's desk for 50 years, I think, and it's absolutely stunning. We've only just put it up, so we're all just getting used to it, and it just feels completely wonderful. And we have some other William Scotts in the house. So William Scott here. So lots of reasons to come to Kettle. So the first thing to say is, please come. The second thing is, I was thinking about today, and I don't know how your day is going. Two words come to mind for my day so far. One is inspiration, and the other one is gratitude. So all the inspiration is, the whole of Kettle Yard right now is literally papered with letters from 1,200 children writing to themselves in the future. And it's a project we did with local schools. It's inspired by Gustav Metzger. Day is called a Day of Action, Remember Nature, but this particular project has been coordinated by Cornelia Parker. She's a great artist, and she has a sort of now already famous film where she interviews children. They talk about imagining the future. So we've asked, or the school teachers have asked with our team, all these children to say what they want to do in the future. It's incredibly moving. I mean, some of them are, dear Cornelia Parker, I love your work, I want to be an artist. Other ones go, dear Stella McCartney, I want to be a fashion designer. But they often then go into how they're going to recycle, how they're going to rethink how things are used. And it's just a reminder for those of us who are a bit older. This is the generation of the future, and it's very, very moving. So that was incredibly inspiring. And I got the impression we were going to have about 100 sort of dotted around. 1,200, they're everywhere. They're all over the house. And as I was leaving from Kettle Yard this evening, it was packed with all the parents. You know, school was over, so they were all coming in to look at their paintings and their letters. And then on gratitude, it's taken me about 5 months to have another meeting with Ai Weiwei. We did a big show with Ai Weiwei in 2023, but he is a very busy artist, as you can imagine. And he's just been doing some extraordinary work in Ukraine, which I hope some of which will come to the UK eventually. And he went up to the front line. So he came in, because his son is at school in Cambridge, but it was jolly difficult to get this meeting with him, even though I know him. Anyway, we were asking him if we could add his name to our Artists at Kettle Yard. And I knew that it needed to be a face-to-face meeting. It wasn't going to work to email Jennifer. She's wonderful. That's the team behind him. It was never. I was going to get a no, basically, if I did that. So he had green tea and some cake. I discussed Ukraine, and then somehow, and Susie's got it on her phone, and Mary's got it on her phone, and Polly's got it on her phone. He offered us 4 artists at Kettle Yard. So this is a selling show to support the Jim and Helen Ede Fund, which I will say more about in a moment. He's given us a 4,000-year-old Han Dynasty jar with Coca-Cola painted on the front. You can see it on scissors. It's a very, very iconic work. He's made a few of them, but not too many. And it's worth about £250,000. So if we can sell it to one of you, everything is going extremely well. This is my gratitude for it. Maybe to you. Anyway, you can have a look at it. It's really, really beautiful. So look, I can show people here. You can see that. It's quite famous, and it's a brilliant collapse of sort of witty idea that almost Coca-Cola could have somehow been there back there 4,000 years ago, as well as the idea that consumerism is everywhere and it kind of its tentacles. So it's very kind of brilliant, and I was asking him about it, and it was sort of found in North China. And I was expecting him to say you can have an edition or something worth a few thousand. So this was amazing. So it's been going well. Gratitude, inspiration, gratitude. So the Jim and Helen Ede Fund, which is why we're having this event, and this wonderful collaboration with Osborne Samuel, is our fund. And the idea is that we're trying to raise £5 million to celebrate, in a sense, our 70th anniversary, which is in 2027. So it's 70 years since Jim and Helen Ede opened the doors in December. I always think it must have been very chilly. Maybe they opened the doors only very quickly. December 1957. And when I walk into the cottages, many of you will know, I always go, this is it. This is December 1957. Nothing, essentially very little has changed, because Jimmy was an extraordinary curator. He made this incredible space full of light, furniture, rugs, everything beautifully placed. Very inspirational, the inspiration to all of you, to everybody. So the Jim and Helen Ede Fund is about sort of securing our future. If we can raise £5 million, we'll have 200 to 250,000 a year forever. And that will do three things for us. It will allow us to endow the post of Senior Curator, Housing Collection, post held by Dr Inga Fraser. That is important to us. That is the absolute heart of Kettle's Yard. And you wouldn't think so, but we always feel as though we're a little bit under threat for funding from the Arts Council, from the university. Certainly the funding doesn't go up. So this would secure it. Secondly, it will allow us to commission contemporary artists. So we just had Louvain, who had our way a few years ago. We are pretty ambitious with our exhibition programme, just in the way that Jim Ede was ambitious as well in his relationships with artists. And thirdly, and this relates in a way to my inspiration with these wonderful children, our amazing pioneering programme in North Cambridge with schools and community groups. Karen, who is one of our sort of staff heroes, Karen Thomas, she is with our support, obviously, it's a team thing, but she's casting around every year little bits of project funding to keep working with schools and groups, and we know how it changes lives. So if we can succeed with the Jim and Helen Ede Fund, she will have a much larger set amount of money every year. So this is all about the future, new generations, discovering Kettle's Yard and enjoying it. And I've said too much, but it's wonderful to see you all, and I'm now going to hand over to Inga.
Thank you. I mean, just to begin, it's worth stating that it's a fact of working in academia that very rarely are you ever in a position to be sitting down and talking to two people whose reading and project so closely aligns with your own. So I'm very grateful this evening to be in conversation with Judith LeGrove, who has written the book which you will see dotted around the room, thinking about Jim Ede as a gentle messiah, and also Laura Freeman, who is chief art critic of the Times and has written a book, a biography of Jim Ede, Ways of Life, Jim Ede and the Kettle's Yard Artists, which is now out in paperback.
Which I'm hoping Laura might sign a few copies if anybody wants one tonight.
Excellent Christmas present.
Yeah. So it's worth saying that before I had taken up the role of senior curator at Kettle's Yard, I've obviously been aware for a while of Jim Ede as a kind of connective figure in modern British art. And like any good art history student, I had of course read Savage Messiah, drawn, I think in my case, by the sort of rather garish combination of the painted self-portrait and the kind of 1970s typography in a second-hand shop. I was obviously also aware of Kettle's Yard as a preeminent essay in the modernist aspiration to unite art and life. And I was also aware of his role at the Tate, where I also worked for several years before starting at Kettle's Yard. But it's fair to say that the real details of Ede's life were not at all widely known prior to the publication of Laura's book in 2023, which was very happily aligned with my interview. And so I purchased the book in hardback and read in detail about Jim Ede prior to being interviewed. So adding to this growing bibliography, including Judith's book and Laura's book, we're currently working on 2 books at Kettle's Yard, a revised and expanded house guidebook, which kind of catalogues the collection, including all the more incidental objects, in much more detail than has been possible previously. And we're also publishing a revised and expanded collection of Jim Ede's letters to and from artists, in addition to the kind of images of the works that are in the collection, both those that are ordinarily on display and those that are usually in store. And it was really working on these books that give you this amazing kind of in-depth sense of how he related to artists and what inspired him in his building his own collection. So my very first question to my fellow travellers and interlocutors this evening is about each of your journeys towards Jim Ede. So, as I said, my kind of modern British experience was fairly predictable in leading me to Jim Ede and Kettle's Yard. But Laura, why don't you start by telling us how you came to Jim Ede?
Well, I read History of Art at Magdalen, and I went up in Freshers' Week, and I wasn't very good at Freshers' Week. I don't drink, and I'm not really a party person, and I found this sort of round of curry and pub and bop and so on a bit difficult. But I was fortunate that the other art historian in my year had grown up in Newmarket, and so she knew Cambridge and she knew Kettle's Yard. And so one afternoon in Freshers' Week, said, I'm going to take you to this really special place. I'm not going to tell you anything about it, because I just want you to experience it kind of cold. So we sort of went off down the road on a rather damp October afternoon and rang the bell, as so many people have done before and since. And the door was opened, and at that time there wasn't a cloakroom, so you still sort of shuffled your bags into a cupboard, and you were given a little fob to hold. And I just remember thinking this was absolutely magic. And particularly I remember coming up that spiral staircase, and on the left is that David Jones Flora in Calyx light, those 3 beautiful chalices with this great profusion of blooms exploding from them, and there are crucifixion scene. And I just thought that's the most beautiful painting I've seen in my life. And history of art undergraduates have to write a dissertation on a work of art architecture in Cambridge, and I did the David Jones painting.
Excuse me, can you speak up a bit?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
And I suppose even so in that year, thinking a lot about David Jones and Florian Calyx Light and Kettle's Yard, that was almost my sort of in. But if you told me then at 19 that I was going to end up writing a biography of Jim Ede, I wouldn't really have believed you, partly because when I graduated I thought, that's it, no more history of art, I've had enough, no more exams, and I kind of went sort of cold turkey. I barely went to an exhibition for about 2 years, and I was working in a newsroom and then sort of found my way back to art after that.
Fascinating. Judith, tell me about your journey. Tell us about your journey.
Well, that was even more unexpected. I was reading music at Cambridge, at Jesus College, which is just round the corner from Kettle's Yard. I had no idea, I'd never heard of Kettle's Yard. So our Director of Studies had a subscription to the concerts. So he used to pass the card for these concerts into your pigeonhole, and if you're lucky, you got to go to one of them. So I went to Kettle's Yard. I had no idea how to get there, how to get in, and I walked into it, and I was absolutely petrified by this whole context. I'd never been in a place like that. I had no idea. So I went very silently upstairs, went to the back, and sat in a corner where actually you can't see any of the performers, but it was an extraordinary experience, an amazing concert. And I went out, and I have to say I still had no idea what Kettle's Yard was, and we all carried on doing our music for the rest of the year and didn't really think any more about it. A couple of years later I left. I got a job at the Britten Peers Foundation in Aldborough, which is Benjamin Britten's house, and of course I walked into the amazing music room, which is the library, the old library converted from a stable building. And immediately it was almost as if it was Kettle's Yard. There was the grand piano, there was the tiled floor, the rugs and everything. And so that was the point at which, also I was put in charge of the art collection, not knowing anything about it. They said, you draw a little bit so you can come curate the art collection. It's quite logical, really. And so I just started going back to Kettle's Yard, and again met Michael Harrison, and I fell in love with it.
I love collecting these stories, and it's been my absolute privilege in this role to sort of ask people how they first encountered Kettle's Yard, and it always has this sort of slightly magical note. So thank you. So obviously I like going back in time and thinking about where things begun. So thinking about Jim Ede's journey now, I wonder whether, Laura, you might start by talking us through some of the predecessors to Kettle's Yard. So the thing that people sort of often overlook who don't know Kettle's Yard very well is that at the point at which they moved in there, Jim and Helen were in their 60s and had lived in many other places before. So let's go right back to the beginning in London. Elm Row, Hampstead, a sort of rather oversized house for their budget. Why don't you tell us about Hampstead?
I might go even further back. So Jim was born in 1895 in Penarth, outside Cardiff, and his parents had very Victorian taste, very heavy. You sort of think about that late William Morris, very dark, pomegranate, antimacassars on the back of chairs, lots of knickknacks, lots of curios. Roger Fry called that period, the age of the Ottoman and the whatnot. These slightly pointless bits of furniture on which you would put endless ornaments that your maid might dust. So Jim grew up in that setting and sort of in some ways spent the rest of his life aesthetically rebelling against it. The first place he did that was Elm Row, which is this beautiful Queen Anne house in Hampstead. It would be lovely if junior curators at the Tate today could afford to live on Elm Row. I think the last time I looked on Zoopla, that house had sold for £7.5 million. But here Jim lived in rather modest splendour. It was a house that probably today an interior designer would say had good bones. And part of the Jim way was often to find houses that had beautiful architectural detailing and actually do very little. He doesn't have swagged curtains. He doesn't have wallpaper. He lets the room speak for himself. He always said, to look for inspiration, you look at a Vermeer painting, see the way that the light pours through a window. You don't want lots of detailing around a window. You don't want lots of soft furnishings. So what he begins to do at Elm Row is both gather together people and works of art. Working there, he was working at the Tate, which was then a sort of temple to Lord Leighton's nymphs. And, that sort of kind of, well, I would say rather revolting. Some of you may like it, but those sort of classical mythological paintings of young ladies in a state of undress. And that really wasn't Jim's thing at all. And what he was doing is, outside of office hours, was seeking out artists like Ben Nicholson, Winifred Nicholson, Christopher Wood, Barbara Hepworth, Henry Moore, who also happened to be his neighbours in Hampstead, and beginning to acquire their work, often for very little money at all. I mean, we're sitting underneath two Winifred Nicholsons. One of Jim's regrets was that actually, when he first met the Nicholsons, she was the bigger sell in a way. She could command the greater prices. And he wasn't able to buy her work in the way he could Ben Nicholson's, which he would buy for £5. Often on the understanding that when Ben was a great success, he might give it back to Ben to sell. But Jim he didn't love giving things back. He could be generous, but he also did like to hang on to the best stuff. So in Elm Row, he filled the rooms. He befriended Brancusi. So in the centre of a table, there would be Brancusi's head, Brancusi's fish. He came into possession of the entire Gaudiya Breshka estate, which is perhaps a convoluted saga that is too long to do this evening. But through slightly underhand, insider trading means, he gets hold of the estate. So he is unpacking crate after crate of Breshka sculptures that he is arranging around his house, including the little dachshund sort of sitting in the window watching visitors as they arrive up the Elm Row garden path. I think if I could go back in time, I would love to go to one of the Sunday teas at Elm Row with Helen playing her piano and all these incredible works of art just sort of sitting there, 2 foot away from you.
It's worth saying that the visitor books, so we have the visitor books in our archive, and reading the kind of lists of people are just essentially a who's who in London at that time. Aristocrats, politicians, members of the Russian ballet. It's really, really diverse, and you get this incredible sense of his sort of artistic atmosphere. I wanted to pause a bit about his jobs and thinking about the kind of facilitative aspect of his work at Tate and the National Gallery. I was in the National Gallery archive a while ago and reading, any letters that were kept while Jim Ede was working there. So obviously the National Gallery becoming the National Gallery of British Art, becoming the Tate. And one of the letters is him requesting funds to go and see Bernard Berenson in Florence and spend time researching his book on Florentine drawings. And I think Tate also then provided him with this excuse to go to Paris. You've mentioned Brancusi, Miro, Braque, there's so many others. And Brancusi's studio was this incredible kind of place of pilgrimage for a lot of British artists in particular. And it was that sort of setting of a kind of holistic setting of art and light, which you find sort of echoed in so many configurations at Kettle's Yard. I wonder whether we could say anything about role models at this time. Who were the sort of influences that Jim Ede was looking to in his collections? Laura, Judith?
He befriended Edward Marsh, who was a civil servant. He was private secretary to Winston Churchill through much of Churchill's political career. But Marsh was a fantastic art collector. And what drove Marsh was saying there's no good buying work by dead artists. It doesn't do them any good once they're 6 feet under. You've got to buy works by young, living artists so that you can support them. And I think this really struck a chord with Jim, because in some ways, we think about him as so much a man of the 20th century, his finger on the pulse of 20th century British modernism. But certainly in his early days, when he first worked at the National Gallery, he was sort of in love with the Quattrocento. He was in love with the Dutch Golden Age. There's this kind of historic impetus that drives him as well. He didn't really have any sort of academic education. He had never gone to university. He'd been to art school, but that had been interrupted by the First World War. But when he gets the job at the National Gallery, working in the photographic archive, essentially curating and archiving photographs of all the paintings on the wall, it sort of gave him a crash course in the entire history of Western art. So the images that kind of inform him, aren't just the artists he's seeing in the little galleries around Cork Street, but, it's Piero della Francesca and it's Fra Angelico. And I think you've got to almost have kind of Fra Angelico in your mind as you're going around Kettle's Yard, because actually there's rather spare, beautiful rooms with these serene lines. That's coming as much from the Italian Renaissance as it is from the 1950s or 1940s.
I was also thinking about the house guests as well, and thinking, your kind of engagement with David Jones. So David Jones was someone who stayed often at the Eaves house in Hampstead, and there are many other artists who also kind of lived there, kind of on and off. I think Margaret Gardner sublet the flat in the attic for some years. So really he was able to sort of take his time, and it's what you're describing about getting to know the National Gallery collection, but also have this sort of ongoing conversation with artists to really sort of get into their way of thinking about their art and painting and sculpture. We can move on to Tangier. Laura, I wonder whether you want to say anything about the reason that they moved. I mean, they had been in Tangier staying with Edward Wolfe on Wolfe's invitation. The Edes both went there, and Ede used that time in 1929 to kind of finish the manuscript for Savage Messiah. But what caused him in 1936 to give up Elm Road, give up the Tate, and kind of move over there wholesale?
I think there were various driving factors. I think he was quite thwarted at Tate. He was never a very good committee man. He wasn't very good at playing by other people's rules, and he struggled at Tate. And then he really struggled at the University of Cambridge to behave himself, at committees. And he's always very much his own man. And it's interesting because he is a near contemporary of Kenneth Clark, and Clark obviously had this kind of meteoric rise in becoming the youngest ever director of the National Gallery. And in some ways, if Jim Ede had been a little bit more able to play the game, I think he could have been director of the Tate. I suppose there were various factors. He had a nervous breakdown while he was writing the book, and writing books is hard work. But there was this extraordinary flood at the Tate in 1928, where the Thames burst its banks in January, and the Tate basement filled with freezing cold water. And Jim Ede was called in to help try and salvage what paintings he could. And he spent sort of several days and nights, up to his waist in icy water, literally wringing out Turner drawings and watercolours. And this seems to have brought back the memories of being in the trenches in Flanders, and he seems to have had some sort of nervous breakdown, combination of thwarted at work, miserable about the flood, pressure of the book, gets appendicitis, all these sorts of things. Lots of things go wrong all at once. He goes on this rescue to Tangier, and I think rather falls in love with it, and the heat and the warmth and just a different way of life. I think certainly when he goes out there in 1936, he has good intentions to write another book, and I think he thinks he's going to write a biography of T. Lawrence for a while. It doesn't quite work out like that. I need to give Andrew Nairne some credit here, because the house that Jim Ede built, Whitestone in Tangier, had eluded generations of Kettle's Yard scholars, and no one had found it, and PhD students had been out there. And Andrew Nairne, using sat-nav and zigzagging up and down every single road on this mountain outside Tangier, at last found it. And I think in rather a bad state of repair, but brilliantly. So Jim and Helen, having built this incredible sort of modernist palace, this sort of almost Le Corbusier style house on a mountainside, also built a little cottage. And you met the people who now live there. It's called Whitestone 2, the little house. And rather wonderfully, this couple, this Moroccan couple, sort of in this Jim Ede-ish way, open up their house to university students and kind of stage plays in their garden and have salons. And it's almost as sort of the Jim Ede spirit had kind of got into the ground there. But the house itself is in a bad way, isn't it? But it was very different. I think what's so fascinating about Jim Ede's passage through his houses is they're very different. So you have Queen Anne House in Hampstead, you have modernist masterpiece in Tangier, you have sort of country chateau almost in France, and then the Kettle's Yard slum cottages. And yet something about his vision and his collection unifies them all, and he finds a way of, in these very different spaces, making his artwork sit happily and in conversation with one another.
Yeah, it's incredible. You can see a lot of photos in our archive where you see these objects kind of ported across to these different environments, and those amazing kind of Spanish armchairs with a kind of curled wood kind of arms, sitting in Tangier, in a very Spartan kind of environment. Also at Kettle's Yard, also at Elm Row.
But I always say, if you look in Kettle's Yard, so much of the crockery is broken and riveted, and some of it's repaired with gold, and some of it's just with staples. And you think, well, they moved house so many times to mercy that there's anything still intact.
Yeah, I wonder whether, there's anything to kind of read into Jim Ede's vision, thinking about what he kind of took to Tangier or what he perhaps took back. Are there elements of Tangier that you see in Kettle's Yard, for example?
So he had this, Jim was always full of schemes and wheezes, and one of his schemes in Tangier was he opened up the house to British servicemen who were stationed on Gibraltar, which was just over the Straits. And servicemen who'd been there for years and years and years, basically living in barracks with very little spiritual or aesthetic or cultural nourishment. And what Jim and Helen did is they hosted parties of men, I think 6 at a time, for 2 or 3 days. They fed them, they let them hang out in the garden, they played music, Jim lent them books, they looked at the art collection. And Jim had said he had always remembered the kind of, aesthetic and cultural vacuum of being a soldier in the First World War, how there was kind of nothing to kind of, nourish you, warm you, inspire you. And what he wanted to do for these men kind of exiled on this rock was to give them a kind of both a taste of home, but also some sort of introduction to art. And there'd be the odd sort of British Tommy who'd say, I don't get it, looking at, Ben Nicholson's, musical instruments. And Jim would say, well, okay, let's pretend it's not 2 guitars, let's pretend it's 2 drunken sailors kind of leaning on each other for support. And actually, as soon as, you see that in your mind, you can absolutely sort of see those forms. I think one of the things about him is he was a brilliant talker. I think he never talked down, he never talked in jargon. Not having had much of an education himself, I think he was very good at talking to people similarly, perhaps adrift among men who'd been to Cambridge and Oxford. I think he had a real gift for talking about art in a way that was completely human and normal and chatty, and not difficult or off-putting.
There's a brilliant bit in his sort of unpublished memoirs where he talks about sort of needing other people to actually see his collection. And I think he even goes to an extreme and sort of confesses that he doesn't feel like he really exists unless he's sort of with other people and sort of with them to look at art, essentially. So you just get a sense from that statement about how fundamental collecting and looking at art and being with other people while doing so was to Jim Ede. So finally, Laura, before we move on to Judith, thinking about the Ede's relatively brief period in France, again, sort of what motivated that move and why France?
Well, you were talking a moment ago about the need for people, and I think there was an interlude of the Second World War where Jim actually ended up in America doing lectures, and when they came back to Tangier, I think it was rather a changed place. I think they felt themselves rather lonely and isolated. By this time, Jim and Helen's daughters were grown up and had children of their own. I think by this point there were 4 grandchildren and would ultimately be 6. Helen desperately wanted to be closer to her girls, who were then, I think, in Somerset and Sheffield. So they moved to France, which incrementally they were getting closer to their family. But they found this exquisite sort of chateau in that French, not really a castle, but a kind of farmhouse, but with turrets and outhouses. Absolutely gorgeous place. It is now a holiday home on Airbnb, if any of you would like to go and stay there. So they moved there. I don't think it was a great success. I think they lasted 2 winters. It was unbelievably cold. I think it could be sort of, -4 indoors. And they used to sort of huddle in one room with a stove. But the gardens were ravishing by the sound of it. And Jim writes these kind of rapturous descriptions of the fruits and trampling their own wine. It was clearly an absolutely gorgeous place to live. But I think they were kind of marooned from anything and anyone. They were neither in the kind of London art scene, nor were they near their children. So it was a short-lived experiment.
I came across some beautiful photos in the archive recently, which I was trying to figure out whether that was still there. So it had this sort of 4-directional kind of path, and then in the middle was this enormous, must have been related to some kind of winemaking, enormous kind of terracotta bowl that they're actually leaning on standing like that. So it gives you a sense of how large it is. But again, sort of it looks like something that you would see in miniature at Kettle's Yard, but it's about sort of 5 foot high. So Judith, thinking about the move back to England, we've obviously heard a bit about the kind of family context. I wonder whether you could tell us anything about their search for a house in England.
Well, one thing that I found really poignant was a letter that Jim wrote to David Jones in about 1955. He said about the house in France, "I have created a temple of beauty, but it is uninhabited." So although somewhere else he wrote that there were constantly people going trafficking through past and visiting them, they didn't have the same amount of company as they had in Tangier. So he was thinking very hard about what he could do, how he might be able to have people come and look at his house, come and look at his collection. And he talked to various people. Brian Robertson was one, who obviously had a strong connection with Cambridge. Jim had a strong connection with Cambridge. He'd been at school there, the lay school. And drawing on these amazing houses that Jim had visited in America, one of them was Dumbarton Oaks, the home of Robert and Mildred Bliss in Washington, where they'd built an amazing centre where people could come and look at their art. They had a music room, and they had amazing landscaped gardens, obviously done on a huge scale. So Jim came up with the idea that he would create a very poor man's Dumbarton's Oaks, as he called it. So perhaps he thought he might be able to find a grand house outside Cambridge that he would be lent, and he could curate his art collection there. That didn't happen. But then he became aware of some slum cottages, as you said, in Cambridge. And so there's an image of him standing outside, I'm sure you wrote about this, and imagining what the inside could be, what he could do to it. So he managed to get the lease for that. And over the course of a year, he transformed that into a place to house his collection. He built an extension for the bathroom, a spiral staircase he put in, bay windows, and so on. And by the following year, January 1958, he was inviting students to come and visit every afternoon. He had open house during term time, and he created his own ritual of washing floors every morning, tidying up, and so on, and then guiding the students around the house.
Yes, it's so interesting thinking about how the collection kind of fits into this picture. And another kind of collector might have a very set idea of the kind of architecture they want their collection to be housed in, especially when we think back to kind of the modernist setting of Tangier, or even the kind of grand kind of rural setting in France. but that kind of flexibility to sort of, you know, be on the one hand sort of writing to the National Trust to see if they had any spare houses, and then on the other hand settling for these 3 tiny cottages plus the 4th on the end, and sort of having a vision that kind of takes it through there. I always mean to follow this up, but the idea that some of his works were, you know, had been on sojourn with friends like during this time, and I think his mother maybe had some of the David Jones works, and I think, did Ben and Barbara have the Miro?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I love, when I went to interview Mary Ede, who's Jim's surviving daughter, she's got this lovely little David Jones on the upstairs landing. I said, oh, that's nice. Where did that come from? And she sort of giggled, said, we stole it. When Jim and Helen were in America during the war, Mary and Elizabeth were kind of furnishing their kind of first, you know, young girls' flat. And they just went into their grandmother's attic and said, we'll have a David Jones, we'll have a Ben Nicholson, we'll have a this, we'll have a that. And not all of it made its way back. So, you know, Mary had hung on to it. So his collection had sort of slightly been scattered to the winds. And then he sort of, you know, he starts trying to kind of draw it all back, doesn't he, and find space for it.
And I suppose it's in that process of drawing it all back that he begins to think about how he might add to it. And Judith, I wonder whether you can say anything about the artist that sort of began to interest Ede towards the end of the 50s and into the early 60s.
Well, yes, it's quite interesting because he seemed to be thinking about, on the one hand, filling in gaps. So he was looking at the artists he already knew, such as Ben Nicholson, and trying to acquire more works. On the other hand, he seemed to be thinking about branching out in quite extraordinary ways. He wrote to Norman Reed at the Tate and said, well, you've got over 60 Rothkos. Well, I don't suppose you'd miss a couple of those. Why not lend them to Kettle's Yard? And of course, that didn't work, but it was kind of quite extreme in a way. But he did also start meeting younger artists, such as John Blackburn, and he became a major supporter, collector, and promoter of his work.
I think it's really interesting because when he's, you know, the timing of at what point he begins to think the cottages are too small and that he might need more space to kind of extend it and kind of display more of his collection is really interesting, because then that kind of idea of filling gaps really kind of accelerates. But also this sort of dreaming towards other artists. And it was when I was doing last year we did a small display of works by Barbara Hepworth in our collection, and sort of reading through that correspondence at the Tate, there's this brilliant letter that he's, firstly trying to acquire a work by Barbara Hepworth, having seen her 1968 Tate retrospective and finally being convinced that he should get one. But he also kind of writes and says, you know, I want a Heron, I want a Rousseau, like, you know, there's so many artists that he wants that you're not necessarily thinking, oh, you would want those artists because you identify him with a small group. And it's very interesting for me, being very used to the kind of artworks by the artists who are in Kettle's Yard, to sort of be in this context that is sort of reimagined and see other works by those artists. And I wonder, to what extent do you think Jim Ede carried through a particular taste from his sort of collecting in the late 20s and early 30s to the types of works he was interested in the 60s, in the early 60s?
I think he was always interested in the St Ives artists, and there is a sort of an aesthetic, an abstract tendency to buy abstract paintings. There are particular colours that sort of harmonise with the interior. Beautiful interior of Kettle's Yard with the brick and the wood, very natural colours.
So we've talked a lot about the kind of artists and the kind of places that inspired Jim Ede's vision, and I wanted to think more sort of abstractly, perhaps about the kind of intellectual and spiritual kind of influences. Laura, I don't know whether there are particular kind of writers that came up in your research, or, you know, in terms of books around the house that were obviously quite important to Jim Ede.
I mean, I think the friendship with David Jones, I think, is incredibly important. And David Jones wrote this long poem called, I can never pronounce it properly, but the Anathemata, which in Greek means the sort of beautiful things, you know, lifted up in honour of the gods. And I think this idea, you know, David Jones used to talk about the thinginess of things. And you know, Jim kind of invested in goblets or sculptures or seed heads or flowers, a sort of almost spiritual significance. And I think, for him, arranging flowers or polishing glassware was a sort of kind of communion with God. His parents had been very, very observant Wesleyans, terribly well behaved. Jim went through various spiritual crises. At one point, thought of becoming a Catholic and then felt he couldn't go that far. There's letters back and forth with David Jones, who did convert to Catholicism. And Jim eventually is baptised into the Church of England at Cambridge. And I think I once at a book event tried to talk about, Jim as a Christian, and one member of the audience got a bit cross and said, no, we can only talk about Jim in sort of spiritual terms. But I think this, Christian faith, I think really did underpin a great deal of his life. I think Helen worried about it sometimes. I think she said, I think you were better when you sort of carried your church around with you in your heart, and rather than trying to fit yourself into an existing religion. But his faith was clearly really important to him, particularly when he was very elderly in Edinburgh. He went to church, religiously. And I think it was a great, comfort to him when Helen died, and then, when he was ailing at the very end.
And Judith, I wonder whether we can think about music in those terms as a sort of abstract influence that obviously continues in Kettle's Yard, but what influence did that have on Jim's kind of aesthetics and kind of idea of what's important about art?
I'm not sure if it did, but I think what it does is it brings the collection alive in a different way. And he always talked about, it's only, what is the actual quote, when it's living, it's only
alive when used.
Only alive when used. And I thought very much that the second time I went to a concert in Kettle's Yard, I didn't go to the back. I was sort of driven towards the very low white sofa right next to the piano, and you are actually at the elbows of the performers. And what you get is an extraordinary experience. You can hear their breath as they kind of prepare for each phrase, and they communicate with each other. And that is a very vital experience. It's quite different from being in a concert hall. And I think that the surroundings, the idea of the privileged setting, you are going into something that's essentially somebody's created and put a lot of love and care into it. You get a special sort of attentiveness there. It's a different sort of listening. So I think that's a very important thing. It's not an abstract thing, it's a sort of a living thing for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And bringing us very neatly on to kind of where I wanted to finish, which is about sort of Kettle's Yard, and Andrew alluded to the quote earlier about sort of growing and changing. So in his own book about Kettle's Yard, Jim Ede wrote that Kettle's Yard should change, but only very slowly. And well, as any good conservative will tell you, there's only a certain degree to which you can actually control the degree to which it's changing. And now, of course, we stand sort of almost 70 years since the Edes first opened their doors. Chairs break, rugs are replaced, breakages are mended. It's also worth noting that previous curators and directors have kind of implemented a few sort of very judicious changes in the house. We have, I think, Jeremy Lewison to thank for an Albach drawing and a new set of shelves in the library. And then Michael Harrison introduced actually works by Ian Hamilton Finlay, who I mentioned earlier. And so actually very recently, Andrew mentioned the Scott, but we've added a very few works to the kind of permanent displays in the house for the next 5 years, some of which were actually collected by Jim Ede and were sort of very much part and actually listed as being on display in the house in the very first catalogue, so prior to the extension being finished. So the artist Avinash Chandra, we've hung 2 works that were given to Jim Ede by that artist in the house. We've hung a painting by Gillian Ayres that was bequeathed to us by Brian Robertson. And new acquisitions from Cambridge-based artist Issam Corbage and the fellow gallerist and friend of Winifred Nicholson, Lee Wan Chia. And we place these works in areas of the house that have sort of changed over the years for different reasons, sort of walls being kind of slightly altered as the kind of galleries have changed. The attic, which until 1968 was hung with collection works paintings, and only after the extension opened became sort of this dedicated space to Godia Breshka. And also Helen's bedroom, which wasn't open to visitors during the time that the Edes lived there. So I suppose curating the house and collection is this sort of balancing act between sort of making sure that it kind of functions as Jim Ede intended, as a sort of sanctuary and a place of contemplation that new generations can have and kind of find themselves in, but also trying to keep this idea of it changing very slowly. So it's been my pleasure to discuss Jim Ede's vision with both of you this evening, and I encourage you to join us on the next 70 years of Kettle's Yard's journey and contribute to our wonderful legacy through Jim Ede.